I was a wedding photographer for 8 years and watched hundreds of couples begin their marriages through a lens. The things I saw that no one else in the room noticed changed everything I believed about people, promises, and what it actually means to commit to someone. There is a moment that happens at almost every wedding, usually somewhere between the ceremony and the reception, when the couple is briefly alone, or as alone as two people can be when there is a photographer 6 feet away pretending to be furniture. The guests have moved on to cocktail hour, the officiant has packed up their notes, the family has dispersed into the specific social management that families perform at weddings. And the two people who have just made the largest promise of their lives stand together for 60 or 90 seconds in the now empty space where the ceremony happened, and they look at each other, and something passes between them that has nothing to do with the performance that preceded it. I have photographed that moment more than 200 times. I have never shown most of those photographs to anyone. Not because they are unflattering or private in any scandalous sense, because they are the most true photographs I have ever taken, and the truth in them is not always the truth that people want framed and hung on a wall. Some of them are the most beautiful images I have ever made. Some of them are images I have looked at alone, long after the wedding, and thought, I wonder how they are doing, I wonder if it held. My name is Rachel Sue, and I was a wedding photographer for 8 years, from the age of 27 to 35, in a career that I entered by accident and left by choice, and that changed how I understand human beings in ways I am still, years later, attempting to fully account for. This is my attempt. I did not set out to be a wedding photographer. I set out to be a documentary photographer, the kind who goes to places where things are happening and makes images that tell the truth about them. I had studied photography seriously, had done 2 years of editorial work after graduating, had shot assignments for regional magazines and small newspapers, had developed a style that was observational and patient and uncomfortable with performance. I liked to wait. I liked the moment before the moment, and the moment after, when people forgot the camera was there. I did not particularly like the moment itself, when people were aware of being photographed and adjusted accordingly. The adjusted version of a person was not what I was interested in. Wedding photography was supposed to be temporary. A friend of a friend needed someone at short notice for her wedding. My name was mentioned. The fee was more than I had made in the previous 2 months combined, and I said yes without particular enthusiasm or expectation. The wedding was in September, a small outdoor ceremony in a garden outside Portland, maybe 80 guests, the couple in their early 30s. I arrived with my usual equipment and my usual approach, observational, unobtrusive, focused on the edges of events rather than their centers, on the faces watching rather than the faces being watched. I did the standard coverage that the couple wanted. The ceremony, the first dance, the family portraits that are the actual labor of wedding photography and that no one who hasn't done them appreciates. And then, between the ceremony and the reception, I found myself in the garden while the couple was briefly alone, and I raised my camera on instinct, and I took a photograph that I have kept ever since and that started something in me that took 8 years to fully understand. In the photograph, the groom is looking at his new wife with an expression I had never seen on anyone's face before and that I have since seen many times. It is not the expression of someone who is happy, exactly, though happiness is somewhere in it. It is the expression of someone who has just done something irrevocable and is looking at the person they have done it with and feeling, simultaneously, the full weight of the irrevocability and the full rightness of it. It is the face of someone standing at the edge of their own life, looking at the person they have chosen to stand there with, and finding that the ground is solid. I did not know how to name that expression when I photographed it. I named it later, after seeing it again and again in different faces over 8 years. I called it, in my own private taxonomy of the things I photographed at weddings, the genuine one, because what I learned, over 260 weddings in 8 years, was that most expressions at weddings are not that one. And the difference between the ones that are and the ones that aren't is the most interesting and difficult thing I have spent my professional life looking at. Let me tell you about the practical reality of wedding photography before I tell you about what it taught me, because without the practical reality, the lessons don't make sense in the right way. Wedding photography is, first and foremost, a logistical operation. You are managing light, location, timing, family dynamics, weather, and the emotional states of multiple people simultaneously, while also making technically competent images under conditions that are frequently not ideal. The hours are long. I was typically on my feet for 10 to 12 hours on a wedding day, carrying 20 pounds of equipment, making 400 to 800 images across a range of lighting conditions from bright outdoor afternoon to dim reception hall candlelight. The physical demands are real and they accumulate. By Sunday morning after a Saturday wedding, I moved like someone who had been in a minor collision. But the logistical demands, though real, were not what made the job difficult. What made it difficult was the emotional labor of being present in an intimate human moment, continuously, as a professional observer. A wedding is not one event. It is 20 or 30 distinct emotional events compressed into a single day, each with its own register. The quiet anxiety of the getting ready hours, the specific solemnity of the ceremony, the release of cocktail hour, the performed joy of the reception, the real joy underneath the performed joy, and the exhaustion that sets in after 9 hours that produces, in the final hours of a wedding, a kind of honesty that the earlier parts of the day don't always have. A wedding photographer witnesses all of these registers. You are present for the full arc of the day in a way that no guest is, because guests come and go, find each other, retreat to corners, miss things. The photographer sees everything. Everything in 8 years was a lot. And after the first year or two, when the technical challenges had become manageable enough that I could give the observational part of my attention more fully to what I was seeing, what I began to see was not what the wedding industry and most wedding guests were looking at. Most people at a wedding are watching the performance. The dress, the flowers, the choreography of the ceremony, the speeches, the cake. These are real and they matter, and I photographed them conscientiously because they were what the couple had asked for, and they were the artifacts that would live on walls and in albums and be shown to children. I have nothing against the performance of a wedding. Rituals require performance. The performance is the point, in a specific and important sense. But underneath the performance, running parallel to it, available only to someone who was watching not the choreography but the faces watching the choreography, was another wedding entirely. And that wedding was far more interesting, and far less predictable, and contained more information about what was actually going to happen to these two people than anything in the ceremony script. I want to tell you about some of the things I saw. Not specific couples, I will not name anyone, and I will change details that could identify particular people, because what I observed was observed in a professional context, and the people involved did not consent to having their unguarded moments turned into material. But the patterns I observed, across 260 weddings, are not any one person's private experience. They are, I believe, something closer to a map of how people actually relate to commitment, love, and the enormous complicated act of standing up in front of everyone you know and making a promise you intend to keep forever. The first thing I learned to look for was what I came to call the witness moment. This is the moment, usually during the exchange of vows, when the person who is speaking, reciting the vows, making the promise, stops performing the vows and starts actually saying them. It is a subtle shift, and it happens in some people and not in others. In the people it doesn't happen. The vows are delivered beautifully, memorized or read with care, hitting the emotional notes that vows are written to hit. The guests are moved. The partner is moved. The photographer is moved if she is not paying close attention. But in the people it does happen, there is a moment, often a single line, sometimes a single word, where something behind the face changes. The performed emotion and the actual emotion, which have been running in parallel, briefly coincide. The voice changes almost imperceptibly. The eyes change. Not dramatically, this is not a breakdown or a visible display. It is quieter than that. It is the moment when the person saying the words understands in some cellular way what the words mean. When the abstract concept of the promise encounters the specific reality of the person standing across from them and the future they are choosing together. I began photographing that moment specifically. Not in every wedding, it didn't happen in every wedding, and I am going to be honest about that, but when it happened, I knew it immediately and I raised my camera and I took the photograph, usually in a burst of 3 or 4 frames, and I would know without checking which frame it was. The moment was there in the image with a clarity that surprised me every time, even after I had seen it dozens of times. What I did not expect when I started photographing this way was how often the witness moment happened in one person and not the other. I am not talking about couples where one person clearly loved the other more, though that exists and is its own uncomfortable category of observation. I am talking about something more specific, the difference between a person who has thought about what a promise is and a person who has thought about the wedding. Both people love each other. Both people intend to keep the promise, but one of them, on this particular day, in this particular moment, understands something about what they are undertaking that the other does not, yet. And the camera, which sees faces with a precision that the human eye in the room does not, records the difference. The second thing I learned to watch was the family, specifically the family of each person during the ceremony. Guests at weddings watch the couple, I watch the parents. This is where most of the information lives. A couple can perform ease and certainty at a wedding. They have prepared for it, they have rehearsed it in some form. They are surrounded by support and moving through a choreography that provides structure. Their families have not rehearsed. Their families are watching the person they raised agree to a life with a person they may know well or barely at all, and the response to that is unmanaged in a way that the couple's responses often aren't. I have seen parents look at their child's new spouse with an expression I can only describe as private relief, the specific loosening of a person who has been worried for a long time and is seeing the worry resolve. I have seen the opposite, a controlled neutrality that is different from actual neutrality, the face of someone who has decided what they are going to show and is maintaining it with effort. I have seen parents cry at the moment their child says the vows and parents who hold completely still at that moment in a way that contains more than stillness. What the family's faces tell you is not whether the marriage will work. I am not claiming to have photographed some kind of predictive truth. What they tell you is the context. Every couple arrives at the altar with a history that stretches back decades, through the families that shaped them, through the things that were said and not done in the houses they grew up in. The wedding ceremony is a public event, but it is also the most recent event in a very long private series, and the families in the room are the people who know that series most completely. Their faces reflect it, not always legibly, but always honestly. I have one photograph that I have never been able to look at without feeling something complex. It is of a mother, the groom's mother, watching her son exchange vows with his bride. The ceremony was beautiful. The couple was clearly in love. The guests were happy. And this woman's face, over the course of the vows, moved through an expression that I can only describe as the full complexity of a human life in a single passage of time. Pride and grief, and something that looked like recognition, and something that looked like letting go of a weight she had been carrying for so long that the letting go was itself disorienting. It is the most honest photograph I have ever taken. She has never seen it. It was not the kind of image she asked for. The third thing, and the thing that took me the longest to understand, was what happened at the receptions. Specifically, late in the receptions, after the speeches and the first dance and the cake, and the hours of photographs with every possible combination of people. After all of that, in the last hour or two of the evening, when the formal structure of the day had dissolved, and what remained was just people at a party that happened to have started with a wedding. This is when I put down the camera most often. Not because I wasn't working, I was always working, always looking for the image in the corner that nobody else was watching. But this is when I watched, rather than photographed, in the specific way of a person who has been observing human beings professionally for years and has developed a set of questions that the observations are organized around. The question I was always asking, late in the reception, was, how do these two people treat each other when nobody is watching? Or rather, when they think nobody is watching, which is not the same thing, because a wedding photographer is always watching, and people know this abstractly but forget it concretely, especially after several hours and several glasses of wine, and the specific fatigue of having been performing your best self since early morning. What I saw, in those late reception observations, across hundreds of weddings, sorted itself over time into patterns that I could not have predicted, and that I have never been able to stop thinking about. The couples I remember with the most warmth, the ones whose images I look back at and think, I hope they're okay, I hope it held, were almost never the most visibly romantic couples of the day. They were not necessarily the ones who danced closest, or who couldn't stop touching each other during the ceremony, or who wrote vows that made the entire room cry. What they had in common was something quieter and harder to photograph. They were kind to each other in the small transactional moments of the day. When one of them needed something and the other was nearby, the response was unhesitating. When something went wrong, and something always went wrong, a spilled drink, a late vendor, a family moment that landed badly, one of them moved toward the other without being asked. Not dramatically, just consistently, without making it a thing, without requiring acknowledgement. That consistent small kindness, visible only to someone watching the edges of the day rather than its center, was more legible to me after 8 years than any grand gesture. I am not saying grand gestures are meaningless. I am saying that the information in a grand gesture is less dense than the information in how someone hands their new spouse a glass of water at the end of a long day, without interrupting the conversation the spouse is having, and without needing to be thanked. I want to tell you about the wedding that changed the way I thought about my job, because every photographer who does this work long enough has one, a single day that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about what they were doing and why. Mine was in the 5th year, a Saturday in June, a large wedding, 220 guests, a venue outside the city that had the kind of manicured beauty that costs a significant amount of money to produce and maintain. The couple had hired me after seeing my work through a referral, and from the initial consultation, I had formed the impression of two people who were well-matched in the way that certain people are well-matched, similar backgrounds, similar values as expressed in conversation, a shared fluency in the register of people who have built careful and deliberate lives and approach most things, including marriage, with the same careful deliberateness. The groom's name was Thomas, the bride's name was Simone. I will not tell you more identifying detail than that because what follows is not about them specifically. It is about what I saw and what I made of it and what it cost me to make anything of it at all. The ceremony was beautiful. I mean this without irony. It was one of the more elegant ceremonies I had photographed, the kind that had clearly been planned by two people with strong aesthetic sensibilities and an attention to the emotional arc of the thing, not just its visual surface. The vows were written personally, not read from a template. Thomas went first. His vows were articulate and warm and specific. He referenced particular moments in their relationship, particular things he loved about Simone, particular promises that were not generic but aimed precisely at her. The guests were moved. Simone was visibly moved, in the way of someone receiving something they had not expected to be as good as it was. Then Simone read hers, and I watched Thomas's face while she read them. He was smiling, he was attentive, he was doing everything that a person is supposed to do while their partner reads their wedding vows. And I watched his face through my lens, which sees faces with the particular compression of a 200 focal length that makes expression legible at a distance, and I saw something that I noted and filed, and did not look at directly for the rest of the day. His face, while Simone read her vows, was the face of someone listening to a good speech, not the face of someone hearing themselves described by the person who loves them most. Those are different faces. The first is open and pleasant and receiving. The second has something underneath it, a quality of being recognized that produces an involuntary response, a slight change in the eyes, a micro-expression of something that is not quite surprise but is adjacent to it, the look of a person encountering a truth about themselves that they did not fully know until someone else said it. Thomas's face during Simone's vows did not have that quality. It had the first quality, the good speech quality, and I photographed it, and I moved on, and I told myself what I told myself many times over 8 years. I do not have the full picture. I have a face through a lens for a fraction of a second. I am not a marriage counselor or a psychic or a judge. I am a photographer, and my job is to document, not to interpret, and the interpretations I make in my head are mine, and they stay there. They stayed there. I photographed the reception. I photographed the first dance, which was graceful and warm. I photographed the speeches, which were funny and loving. I photographed the late reception hours with my usual observational attention, and noted, without great surprise, that Thomas was a sociable presence who moved through the room with ease, spending time with many people, and that when he and Simone were in the same part of the room they moved in parallel rather than together, not avoiding each other, simply not gravitating. Two people who were comfortable enough together that proximity did not require closeness. That is not a red flag. That is a description of many functional and happy marriages, particularly among people who are socially fluent and independently comfortable in rooms. I noted it and did not make it into more than it was. What I made it into was nothing. I edited the photographs. I delivered them. They were good photographs. Thomas and Simone sent me a generous thank you note. 2 years later, I heard through a mutual professional contact that they had separated, and I sat with that information for a while, and then I went to my hard drive and opened the folder and looked at the photograph of Thomas's face during Simone's vows. The face was exactly as I had seen it through the lens, the good speech face. And I sat with that photograph, and with the separation, and with the thing I had been telling myself for 5 years about interpretation and limits, and not making more of a moment than a moment contains. What I decided that afternoon was not that I had been wrong to hold back. I had been right to hold back. A photographer is not a counselor, and a face in a fraction of a second is not a diagnosis. I still believe that. What I decided was that the thing I had been seeing over 5 years across hundreds of weddings was real, that the information was in the images whether I acknowledged it or not. That part of what I was doing, whether I had signed up for it or not, was witnessing something that most of the room was not watching, and that the witnessing carried its own kind of responsibility, not to act on it, not to say anything, not to appoint myself arbiter of other people's futures, but to take it seriously. To understand that what I was looking at through the lens was not performance all the way down, and that the thing underneath the performance was worth paying attention to. The 6th year was when I started keeping what I privately called the second archive. Alongside the client deliverables, the edited, curated sets of photographs that went into albums and onto walls, I maintained a separate folder of images that I had made but not delivered. Not because they were bad photographs, because they were the other photographs. The ones from the margins of the day, the ones of the unguarded faces, the ones that contained the information I had been gathering since the September wedding in the Portland garden, and that did not belong in an album. I want to be precise about the ethics of this because I have thought about them carefully. I was not surveilling people. I was not taking hidden photographs of people in private moments. I was present at a public event, hired to make photographs, and some of the photographs I made were more revealing than what the clients had asked for. The images existed. The choice I was making was what to do with them, include them in the delivery or not. I chose not to for the obvious reasons. But I also chose to keep them, rather than delete them, because the documentary photographer that I had started out as could not entirely reconcile herself to the deliberate destruction of true images. The second archive over 3 years accumulated roughly 400 photographs. I looked at them periodically, the way you look at something you don't fully understand yet but know you need to keep looking at. Over time, patterns emerged. Not predictions, I want to say that again clearly, because I am not claiming anything predictive, but categories. Ways that truth showed up in faces during the most watched moment of a person's life. The category I returned to most often was the one I had first noticed at the Portland Garden wedding, what I had called the genuine one, the expression on a face that had moved through performance and arrived at something else. Over 6 years of watching for it, I had come to understand it more precisely. It was not an expression of happiness, exactly, or certainty, or love in any romantic sense. It was closer to what I can only describe as contact, the moment when two people, in the midst of all the choreography and structure and performance of a wedding, briefly and actually touched. Not physically. The contact I mean is something that happens between two people's awareness of each other, something that bypasses the social surface and reaches the actual person underneath. I had seen it in roughly half the weddings I had photographed. In those weddings, it happened somewhere, sometimes in the vows, sometimes in the quiet moment after the ceremony, sometimes in a look across a crowded reception room. And in those weddings, the second archive photographs and the delivered photographs had a different relationship to each other. The delivered photographs were good and the second archive photographs were true, but they were pointing in the same direction. The couple in the album and the couple in the unguarded moments were recognizably the same couple. In the other half they were different, not dramatically, not in a way that meant disaster. Plenty of the marriages I photographed where the contact was less visible or less certain were, I am sure, perfectly fine and lasting and good, but different in a way that I noticed and could not stop noticing. In the 7th year, a thing happened that I had not expected, and that clarified something I had been circling for a long time without reaching. I was hired to photograph a wedding for a woman named Patricia, who was 53 and marrying for the second time. Her first marriage had ended after 21 years, not dramatically, no catastrophic failure, no rupture, just the slow, honest accumulation of two people who had grown in different directions and eventually acknowledged that the distance was no longer bridgeable. She had been single for 4 years before meeting the man she was now marrying, a widower named Graham who was 58 and had, by Patricia's description in our initial consultation, a quality she called present. She said it like it was a rare word, like she was choosing it specifically. The wedding was small, 40 guests. A simple ceremony in a room at a restaurant they both loved, dinner immediately following. There was almost no production value in the conventional sense. No grand floral arrangements, no choreographed first dance, no theatrical lighting. What there was, instead, was a quality of attention in the room that I had rarely encountered at a wedding, and that I believe was a direct consequence of the guest list being composed entirely of people who knew both Patricia and Graham well enough to have opinions about whether this was a good idea, and who were in the room because they had concluded that it was. The ceremony lasted 22 minutes. Patricia went first with her vows. She had written them herself, and they were nothing like what vows usually sound like. They did not follow the "I promise to always" architecture that most self-written vows adopt. They were more observational. She talked about what she had learned the first time about what she needed, and what she hadn't known she needed, and what she had discovered about herself in the 4 years between. She talked about Graham specifically in a way that was not flattering in the conventional sense, but was precise in a way that flattery rarely is. She described what she had seen in him over 2 years that had convinced her that choosing was worth the risk of being wrong again. She said the word risk without softening it. I was photographing her face while she spoke, and then I moved to Graham's face. I have been trying to describe this accurately for some time, and I am not sure I can do it fully. His face while Patricia spoke was the second face, the genuine one, but more than I had seen before, more concentrated, with less of the ambient social performance that most people carry even in their most unguarded moments. He was not watching Patricia make a speech, he was watching Patricia. Just her in the specific way of someone for whom the person in front of them is entirely sufficient, entirely what the moment is about, without the social background noise that usually attends a person's awareness of another person in public. I took 3 photographs in that sequence. The middle one is the best photograph I have ever made. I have never shown it publicly. It is in the second archive. It is a man's face at the moment when he understands, for the second time in his life, that he is loved specifically, not generically, not performatively, but in the particular and accurate way that only a person who has been paying real attention to you can love you. And the understanding on his face is not simple happiness. It is the expression of someone receiving something they had been afraid to hope for. I edited the images from Patricia and Graham's wedding and delivered them 2 weeks later. The delivered photographs were the best wedding photographs I had made in 7 years. The second archive photographs were so far above anything I had made before that I sat with them for a long time before moving them to the folder. Patricia emailed me when she received the gallery. She said, "I don't know how you do this, these are us." That sentence stayed with me. These are us, not these are beautiful or we love them. These are us, as if the photographs had accomplished the thing that photographs at their best accomplish, not recording the surface of an event, but reflecting something true about the people in it back at themselves. I wrote back and thanked her. I did not tell her about the second archive. I did not tell her that the photographs I had delivered, which she loved, were the good photographs, and that the ones she hadn't seen were the true ones, and that the true ones were the reason I was still doing this job in the 7th year when I had planned to do it for 3. The question I had been avoiding for most of the 7th year arrived, as avoided questions tend to, not through a dramatic event, but through a quiet accumulation that reached a tipping point I hadn't marked in advance. I was at a wedding in late October, a medium-sized affair, about 110 guests, a couple in their late 20s who had been together since college and who had the ease of 2 people who had grown up alongside each other, who had become adults in each other's presence, who had the particular fluency of people whose references and shorthand were so intertwined that they sometimes finished each other's sentences not to be cute, but simply because the sentence was already in both of their heads simultaneously. They were lovely. The wedding was lovely. I was 6 hours into a 9-hour day, and somewhere in the middle of the reception, I sat down on a chair at the edge of the room that had been vacated by a guest who had moved to the dance floor, and I looked at the 258th wedding I had photographed, and I thought, for the first time clearly and without deflection, what has this done to me? Not the work, the witnessing. The 8 years of watching people make the largest promise of their lives, and seeing what was underneath the promise, and holding all of that in the second archive of my own mind, alongside the official archive of the delivered photographs. I want to be honest about what the witnessing had cost, because I think it is the most important part of the story, and the part I am most tempted to skip over in favor of the more flattering version, in which a photographer gains wisdom through observation and becomes enlightened about the nature of human love. That version is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. What it had cost was a particular kind of naivety that I had not known I possessed until I no longer possessed it. Before the wedding photography, I had believed in commitment in the way that most people believe in it before they have spent 8 years watching what commitment actually looks like from the outside, as a decision, primarily. A decision that 2 people make and then maintain through the force of the original decision, through will and intention and the structure of a shared life. I had believed that the decision was the hard part, and that once made, it was made, and the life that followed was the working out of a choice already completed. What I understood now, in the chair at the edge of the 110th wedding dance floor, was that the decision was not the hard part. The decision was the beginning of the hard part. What came after the decision, the daily, undramatic, often invisible work of 2 people choosing each other again in the small transactions of an ordinary life, was the actual thing, the substance of it, the thing that the second archive photographs were trying to capture in the single day when the decision was being made for the first time. The witness moment in the vows, the consistent small kindness at the reception, the parents' faces in the ceremony, all of it was the same information, arrived at from different angles. It was not information about the wedding. It was information about what the wedding was the beginning of. And having spent 8 years gathering that information, I was in the peculiar position of knowing more about what marriage required than about whether I was capable of it. Not because I was damaged or cynical, I want to be precise about this. It was not cynicism. Cynicism would have been easier. What it was more like the specific vertigo of a person who has become extremely good at seeing something and has consequently become extremely aware of their own distance from it. I had been in 2 significant relationships during the 8 years of wedding photography. The first ended after 2 years, for reasons that were genuinely mutual and that I do not blame on the job. The second lasted 3 years and ended in the 7th year of my photography career, and the ending was more complicated, and the job was not irrelevant to it. His name was Daniel. He was a structural engineer, which is a profession with a specific cast of mind, rigorous, patient, comfortable with complexity, attentive to the question of what holds things up. We had met at a dinner party, had started seeing each other gradually in the way of 2 people who are both a little careful, and had built something over 3 years that was real and good, and that I think about with the specific warmth of something that was genuinely itself and not a mistake, even though it ended. The ending was my fault, or rather, it was the fault of something I was doing that I did not understand clearly enough at the time to name. What Daniel told me in the conversation where we acknowledged that things had shifted irrecoverably was this: you observe me, you observe everything. You watch me from a distance and you process what you see and you're very precise about it, but you don't let me watch you back. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I sat with it in the chair at the edge of the 110th wedding dance floor a year after he had said it, and I understood it more fully than I had when I first heard it. The second archive had a version of me in it that I had not recognized while I was building it. A person who had become so practiced at observational attention, at receiving the truth about other people, at watching and documenting and filing, that the reciprocal had atrophied. I could see Daniel very clearly. I could tell you with considerable precision how he moved through a room and what his face looked like when he was genuinely happy versus when he was managing something difficult. I had paid him the specific deep attention of a person who watches for a living. What I had not done or had not done enough was let him pay me the same attention, not because I was deliberately withholding, but because the posture of the observer is not the posture of the observed, and I had been an observer for so long, professionally and then personally, that the posture had become structural. I stood behind the camera. I was the one who saw. The scene was everyone else. Daniel had wanted to see me. I had made it difficult, not through any dramatic act of concealment, but through the ordinary, accumulated habit of someone who processes experience through the lens of observation rather than through the lived inside of the experience itself. I want to tell you about what shifted in the last year and a half of the photography career, because the shift was real, and I think it came directly from what the work had been showing me, even when I was resisting the showing. In the 8th year I began, at first tentatively and then more deliberately, to put the camera down at moments when I had previously kept it up. Not neglecting my job, I was always thorough, always delivered what the clients needed. But in the spaces between the required coverage, the spaces where I had previously been filling every moment with observation and image making, I started simply being in the room. Not watching from the edge, being in it. This sounds minor. It was not minor. For someone who had spent 7 years defining their presence at events by the camera in their hands, putting the camera down was a strange and exposing thing. Without the lens, I had no mechanism of distance. I was just a person at a wedding, which meant I was just a person in a room full of human beings experiencing something real, and the experience was no longer filtered through the professional remove of the observer's eye. What I felt, the first few times I did this deliberately, was vulnerability in a form I had not anticipated. Not emotional vulnerability in any dramatic sense. I was not suddenly weeping at strangers' weddings, which would have been both unprofessional and inaccurate. But the low-grade, ordinary vulnerability of a person who is present in a situation rather than documenting it, who is receiving the emotional weight of what is happening rather than processing it through the mediation of craft. I found that I could tolerate it. More than tolerate, I found that the part of me that had become a photographer in the first place, the part that was interested in the truth of moments rather than their performance, was actually better served by presence than by documentation in certain specific instances. There were things I understood about weddings, having put the camera down in the 8th year, that I had not understood in the previous 7 with it up. Things that required being in the room rather than behind the glass. The understanding that arrived most clearly, and that I have kept closest to me since, was this: the couples in the second archive, the ones whose photographs had the quality I was always looking for, the genuine contact, the actual presence of two people with each other, were not extraordinary people. They were not people who had figured something out that other people hadn't, or who had some unusual capacity for connection that most people lacked. They were people who had, on that particular day, and apparently in the daily life that preceded it, made themselves available to be seen. They had taken the observer's posture, which is safe, which keeps the emotional weight at a manageable distance, which gives you the clarity of someone watching rather than the exposure of someone participating, and exchanged it for something less controlled and more actual. That was the whole thing. That was what the second archive was full of. Not love as a feeling, though feelings were in it. Love as a posture. Love as the decision to put the camera down and be in the room. I photographed my 261st and final wedding in August of my 8th year. A small wedding, 60 guests, a couple in their early 40s who had each been through long previous relationships and who brought to the day a quality that I recognized by then immediately and that I had come to think of as the most hopeful thing I regularly witnessed. The specific readiness of people who have learned, through experience and sometimes through difficulty, what they are actually looking for and have found it. The ceremony was in the late afternoon, the reception outdoors as the evening came in. I photographed everything I was there to photograph. And then, in the quiet after the ceremony and before the reception, when the couple was briefly alone in the garden, I did something I had never done before in 8 years. I put my camera down on a nearby chair. I stood there, without a lens between me and the moment, and I watched them. They were standing close, not touching yet, looking at each other in the way of two people who have just done something large and are still inside the largeness of it. The light was the particular gold of August early evening, the kind that makes everything look like a memory while it is still happening. They began to laugh quietly at something one of them said that I couldn't hear, and then the laughter settled and they were just there, the two of them in the garden in the light. I didn't take the photograph. I have thought about that decision many times. Part of me has regretted it. The image would have been extraordinary, the best thing in the second archive, the thing the whole 8 years had been building toward. But the larger part of me, the part that has grown in the years since, understands that not taking the photograph was the point. That there are moments that belong to the people in them and not to the witness, and that learning to recognize that distinction, learning to be in a moment rather than documenting it, learning that presence is not the same as observation, was the actual education that 8 years of watching other people's most honest moments had been offering me. I left the wedding industry that winter, not abruptly, not in any dramatic declaration. I simply stopped taking bookings, finished the final handful of committed weddings, and let the practice close quietly. The second archive is on a hard drive in my desk drawer, 412 photographs of the unguarded margins of other people's most watched days. I am in a relationship now, with a person who watches me back with the same attention that I give them. It is, in the specific vocabulary that 8 years of wedding photography gave me, the genuine one. I know what that looks like, and I know what it costs, and I know that it requires the thing that I spent 8 years photographing in other people before I finally managed it myself. You put the camera down, you stand in the room. You let the moment be the moment and yourself be in it, fully, without the glass between you and the thing you are trying not to miss. There is a question I get asked whenever I tell someone about the 8 years, and I have been asked it enough times now that I know the question before it arrives. It is some version of, did it make you cynical? Did watching that many weddings, seeing what you saw underneath the surface of them, make you stop believing in marriage? The honest answer is no, and I want to explain why, because the no is not simple, and it is not the no of someone who looked at the evidence and decided to believe anyway, which would be a kind of willful optimism that I don't have much patience for. It is the no of someone who looked at the evidence and found that the evidence, taken fully and without selection, did not support cynicism. Here is what the evidence actually showed. Across 261 weddings, I saw a wide and continuous range of what was true underneath the performance. I saw couples who were radiant with the genuine one, and couples whose contact was thinner, and couples across every gradation between those poles. I saw families whose faces told stories of long support and families whose faces told stories of long difficulty, and families who contained both simultaneously, which is most families. I saw vows delivered with the witness moment and vows delivered without it, and vows that started without it and arrived at it halfway through, which was always the most moving to watch. The moment when someone who had been performing a speech crossed some invisible line and started actually saying the words. What I did not see not once in 8 years was a wedding that was simple. Not one. Every single one of the 261 weddings I photographed contained, somewhere in its margins, something more complicated and more human than its surface. The couple who seemed most effortlessly in love had a parent in the room who was watching with a face that told you about a history you didn't know. The wedding that looked most like a performance had a moment, somewhere, usually somewhere I almost missed, of genuine contact that no amount of orchestration could have manufactured. This is what I mean when I say the evidence did not support cynicism. Cynicism requires a simpler picture than the one I was actually looking at. Cynicism says, the performance is the whole thing, and underneath the performance is nothing, or nothing reliable. What I saw was different. What I saw was that the performance and the genuine thing coexisted in almost every case, and that the proportion between them varied, and that the proportion was not fixed. It could shift within a single day, within a single exchange of vows, within a single look across a crowded room late at night. The genuine thing was almost always available. The question was whether the people in the room were looking for it. I was always looking for it. That was the job. And finding it, reliably, in some form or another, in every wedding I photographed over 8 years, was the thing that kept me from cynicism and kept me in the work longer than I had planned. What I came away with instead of cynicism was something that I would describe as a recalibrated respect. Not for marriage as an institution. I had my complicated feelings about institutions and they remain complicated, but for the human act of choosing. The specific, vulnerable, not entirely rational act of standing up in front of everyone you know and saying, this is the person, and I am choosing them, knowing that I cannot know the future and that the choice I am making today will be required of me again, in smaller and less dramatic forms, on every ordinary day that follows. I have thought about what it takes to make that choice honestly, not performatively, not because the flowers are beautiful and the dress is perfect, and the room is full of people who want this for you, but actually and honestly, with full awareness of what you are undertaking. I have watched it happen in enough faces to believe that it is real when it is real, and distinguishable from when it is not, and that the distinguishing information is available to anyone who is paying the right kind of attention. The right kind of attention is not the critical kind. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a version of what I am describing that sounds like judgment, the photographer who has seen enough to know who's going to make it and who isn't, the professional observer cataloguing the marriages most likely to hold. That is not what I am describing, and it is not what I was doing. Judgment requires a confidence about the future that I have never felt entitled to, particularly in this domain, where the variables are so numerous and so human, and so entirely beyond the reach of any single afternoon's observation. What I mean by the right kind of attention is simpler than judgment and harder to maintain. It is the attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what is true, rather than what confirms what they already think. It is the attention that the couples in the second archive had for each other, the attention that sees specifically, that notices the small things because it is looking at the whole person rather than the person's social surface. It is, I think, the foundational act of any relationship that works. Two people paying each other the specific, sustained, genuinely interested attention that says, I see you, not the version of you that you present when you are performing, but the actual you, and I am not going anywhere. This is harder than it sounds. It requires the thing that Daniel identified in me as missing, the willingness to be seen as well as to see, to inhabit the observed position as well as the observers. And it requires something that the 8 years of wedding photography had shown me over and over, in different faces and different circumstances, in the second archive and in the delivered photographs, and in the quiet moments when I put the camera down and just stood in the room. It requires showing up to the ordinary days with the same quality of attention that people bring to the extraordinary ones. I have been thinking, in the time since I stopped photographing weddings, about what the ceremony is actually for. Not the legal or social function, those are real and I don't dismiss them, but the human function. Why do we do this in front of people? Why does it require witnesses? My answer, arrived at through 8 years of being one, is this: the witnesses are not there to watch the performance. The witnesses are there because a promise made only to the person you are promising is a different kind of promise than one made in front of everyone who knows and loves you. The presence of the witnesses changes the act, not because of social accountability, or not only, there is something more fundamental happening. The witnesses are the people who will know, in the years after, whether the promise is being kept. Not because they are watching and monitoring, but because they are in the life, in the daily texture of it, and the keeping or not keeping of a promise like this shows up in the texture of things, whether or not anyone is explicitly tracking it. The photographer is the most thorough of the witnesses, and the most temporary. I was there for one day. The images I made are the record of what that one day looked like from the outside, through my particular lens and my particular accumulated sense of what to look for. What the images could not capture, and what I knew even while making them, was what came after. The dailiness, the ordinary Tuesday version of the promise made on the Saturday. That was always outside my reach, and always the thing that mattered most. What I think now, standing at the distance of several years from the last wedding, is that the ordinary Tuesday is the whole point. The ceremony is the declaration, and declarations matter, but they are not the thing itself. They are the beginning of the thing, the moment when the thing is named and committed to in front of people who will hold you to the naming. The thing itself is what you do on the Tuesdays. How you hand someone a glass of water without interrupting their conversation. How you move toward each other when something goes wrong without waiting to be asked. How you pay attention to the specific person in front of you, on the specific ordinary day you are in, with the same quality of attention that you paid them on the day when everyone was watching. That is the promise, really, not the words in the ceremony, which are beautiful and necessary but abstract. The promise is the attention. The daily, undramatic, entirely invisible decision to see the person you chose and keep choosing them with the same specificity with which you chose them the first time. I still have the second archive. I look at it occasionally, not with the frequency I did while I was in the work, but with a different quality of looking now that I am not building it or trying to understand it in any active way. It is a strange collection, 412 photographs of unguarded human truth that nobody asked me to make, and that nobody except me has seen. I don't know what I will do with it eventually. I have thought about whether it should exist at all, and I have concluded that it should, not because anyone will necessarily ever see it, but because the making of it was the education, and the education was real, and real things should have records. The photograph I think about most is not the one of Graham's face during Patricia's vows, though that is the best one. It is the first one, the September garden in Portland, the groom's face, the expression I had never seen before, and that started everything. I have looked at that face hundreds of times over 8 years, and it has never lost the quality that stopped me the first time. The full weight of the irrevocability and the full rightness of it simultaneously. The ground is solid. I did not know, when I took that photograph at 27, that I was beginning an 8-year education in what that expression required to be true. I did not know that the education would cost me things before it gave me things, or that the giving would be worth the cost, or that the most important lesson would be the one that arrived not through the lens, but in the moment I put it down. I know it now. I try to live inside it rather than observing it. Most days I manage. The ground is solid. That is the whole thing, really. You find the person for whom you can honestly believe that, and then you do the daily work of making it true, and the work is ordinary and invisible and entirely the point. That is what I saw in 261 weddings, through a lens, from the edges of rooms, in the margins of the most watched days of other people's lives. I put the camera down. I came inside. I am still learning what it means to be in the room.